We are going to go now and say a very good morning here to Mr. Richard Cashin with, I guess it's called Energy 41 Inc. Is that right, Richard?
2041.
I'm sorry, 2041 Inc. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Well, if I was subject to depression, I'd be depressed, but I'm not depressed. But I find the situation in my province depressing. I noticed you said earlier you didn't want a circus about the something about the Parliament or debating this Muskrat Falls thing. Well, I was the chair of the Energy Committee in the 60s in the Parliament of Canada.
Right.
And we had a very controversial piece of legislation at the time, the Columbia River Treaty. You might remember it. You were just a little boy at the time.
I would think so, yep.
But in any event, we had the right to call witnesses. We sat for months. And eventually we had an all-party recommendation to accept it. But we had the power to call witnesses. Now, this is not in my mind, the preferred way to go.
No.
What I find is depressing, and I think this is a bigger issue than Muskrat Falls, it is to me, is the abandonment of due process, the attack at the rule of law. Why has this government ignored the PUB? Now, the Premier has said this has been studied to death. Well, there's only been two transparent studies. One was that independent panel which didn't give the okay, the joint federal-provincial one, and then the PUB said, well, they couldn't get the information.
They couldn't give it the okay either.
No, because they couldn't get Now, why the secrecy? Why? So that's why we propose that the committee of the House become a committee of the whole and allow the MHAs to call expert witnesses, which, as I said, has been done in the federal system, maybe in other provinces. Mm-hmm. It's not the desired way, but this was an attempt to demonstrate to the population of Newfoundland, good heavens, are we still a backward place?
I find, Richard, and this is my opposition to the concept of calling witnesses in a committee of the whole circumstance, in this instance, because partisan environment inside the House these days. Maybe things in 30 or 40 years have changed, and maybe not. But I see you're calling some guy in there, and he's an engineer, he's an expert on one side or the other, on the yay or the nay, the pro or the con, doesn't matter. And I can see these MHAs, quite frankly, because of the partisan nature of our legislature today, being what it is, I can see this thing, I think I used the line this morning, like an episode of Perry Mason. And isn't it true that when you were an engineer, you said this at one point in your life back in the... And I'm saying, oh, boys, really?
Okay, so then I have the solution. We'll just abolish Parliament. What are we going to do when this government makes things up as they go? I mean, the woman, the Premier said she's following the template of the Liberals. Well, Voisey's Bay was Inco's money. It wasn't public money. So we've not had a transparent... We have a right as the citizens to have, if you don't want it to go towards Parliament, our Parliament, well, why? And we're only suggesting that because they wouldn't let it go to the PUB. Now, aren't you outraged by that? Doesn't it outrage you? It outrages me.
Mm-hmm. My suggestion would have been, quite frankly, a legislative committee made up of representatives of all parties to study the project, study the contract. That group could certainly, in my view, call expert witnesses, because it's less partisan, and come from that a recommendation or a reference that would then be referred to the entire House of Assembly for consideration. That would have been the process I would have used, but that's me.
We're only discussing tactics now.
That's right.
Yeah. So, but the point is, all of this would not be so urgent if they had followed the due process and referred this to the PUB.
Why do you think they didn't, in your view? Why didn't they follow, as you've termed, Richard, due process?
Because I think I've never seen a government so contemptuous of the parliamentary process. I mean, the Premier herself said she was going to give I heard so many of her comments. One, she patronized the MHAs if they bother to read it. So, I mean, to me, it's inexplicable. They must have something to hide, and that's the first thing that comes to mind. And they're also contemptuous. They don't feel they need to do this because they think Newfoundlanders, the bags are still on our heads. I can remember in the latter days, a friend of mine, although he was a Liberal, he said to me when things were changing in the late 60s, he said, the bags are off our heads. You know, that led to change. Well, I think that's very, very, I mean, it's very disquieting. No other jurisdiction has tolerated this. I mean, why are we tolerating it? See, to me, that's the bigger issue. That's, in the philosophical sense, that's the bigger issue than the merits of the Muskrat Falls, because if they're not following due process in this instance, what other instances are they going to ignore it? I mean, I find this all kind of frightening. So that's why I'm really more outraged by their handling of the process.
As opposed to the issue itself.
Well, the issue itself, I mean, I think if the process was followed, anyone that I've talked to who are knowledgeable on the thing feel that this is unnecessary. And you see, what's happening here, I mean, we're catering to certain vested interests that love to see these projects go ahead, right? A lot of people are going to do well, but we're going to pay for it. And the implications of this on, say, our future ability to provide services to the citizens. If we've got a big $10 billion extra debt and you can't sell the power because we find Quebec now with a surplus of power because of all the fracking and the growth of the oil and gas in the United States. The United States is getting closer to self-sufficiency than they've ever been, or at least for generations.
I guess though, you know, Richard Cashin, could we say this then, that this, as you term it, this contempt of process that you're seeing, this abandonment of due process, do we not see, is the provincial government then following an example, either comes from the previous administration, how Danny Williams ran the government, or are they looking to Ottawa and seeing what a majority government under Stephen Harper is doing in Ottawa and saying, if they can do it, we can do it?
Well, I think it's a combination of all these things. I mean, I think it's an erosion of democracy in our, I mean, you mentioned about partisanship. Well, you know, in the Diefenbaker-Pearson years, I mean, there was a lot of, there was certainly great rivalry and not much love between Pearson and Diefenbaker, and at times debate was acrimonious. But there was no period, I mean, we had full debate. I mean, we had the minority government for 6 years. And we had great debate. And we accomplished, probably was the most ever, it's the equivalent, the 60s Pearson government was the equivalent of the 30s Roosevelt government in the United States as far as accomplishing significant legislation. Today, I mean, even the words, what is it, the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland? Says words mean what I want them to mean. Well, look, we have, they're inventing things set by the Liberals, apples and oranges. Voisey's Bay, private money of Inco, here we have public money. So I have to ask, what are they afraid of? And they are contemptuous. There's no question about it. I can sniff out people who patronize. I've been doing that a long time. And these people are very patronizing of our provincial parliament and as a consequence of our whole population.
Richard Cashin, I've got to end there. I've got to go pay the bills. I thank you for this. Good to speak with you this morning. And let's see if we can get a response from some others out there who may agree or disagree with the approach that you've articulated. Thanks for this.
Okay, bye now.
Have a great day. Bye-bye. What do you think of what Richard Cashin had to say? They have abandoned due process. They are contemptuous of Parliament and of the electorate. Is he right?